as teachers, the very first thing that is common is that the desire to learn, keep on learning and experimenting with things and the latest theories or the work or whatever it is that comes our way, we keep on going with that. We keep on just learning things. So this way, I'm also a learner and I am sharing my point of view and my research on this particular topic with all of you. The topic is the literary engagement with cinema, feminist film theory. So, when we come to this topic that I find very interesting, there are two particular things. One is, of course, literature, and second thing is cinema.
करवा लीजिएगा, गौरव आएगा तो खा लेंगे। कल भी मैंने उसके लिए वो फ्राई कर दिए।
I request all of you to kindly mute yourself. I'm hearing some voices. Thank you. So film studies is the English degree of the 21st century, says Professor Emily Carman. Simply put, movies are literature because they can be analyzed and interpreted in the same ways as traditionally written literature. Cinema needs to show more than books do, even though they are telling the same tale. However, the literary engagement with cinema or film is boundless because they both directly deal with images and the world of possibilities. Literature is looking for new ways of unfolding the plot, building text space and cinematography, new ways of interpreting the stories, and developing a verbal layer of cinetext. So cinema becomes a way of transformation, of reorganization of the perception of a person on screen, of his way by the method of familiarizing the individual with a large cultural layer of the country or the world. So through screenings, the cinema not only indirectly acquaints a person with the text of literary classics, but also participates in the development of the literary text itself, preventing its necrosis. At the same time, it should be said that neither the theory of cinema nor literary criticism has developed a scientific analysis apparatus that contributed to the competent and objective analysis and comparison of these two texts, literary and cinematographic. So one of the biggest advantage of a book being made into a film is seeing the characters come alive and give your imagination a sense of reality. Dean Bob Bassett believed and proclaimed film is the literature of this century. So film criticism has value for literary studies, for it allows us to view them differently, to look for the unconscious reflection of social reality. The underlying power structures, the frames which melt into each other, the repetitive narrative patterns, the dialogues which use myth history, the juxtapositions which take place, and the simultaneity which the medium allows. Films are multi-layered text. We all know that because they are rich with different meanings, denotative and connotative. Some of the film studies approaches include feminism, psychoanalysis, structuralism, Marxism, film genre, auteur theory, etc. So representation of women in films is what the feminist approach to film criticism talks about. It also discusses where women in society stand as compared to men. Early feminists took consciousness raising as a model for feminist theory because it is necessarily both experiential and transformative. So feminist film theory, however, is often universalizing And it makes use of complex language and alienating categories which deny women's experiences as active spectators, enjoying films or reading them critically. I do believe that for better communication and understanding, there is no possible way that literature departments can hold themselves aloof from the technology, specifically cinematic medium, like as in CSJMU or all over UP in MA course, we have a separate paper of film studies. So I think most of you must be having that too. So there is no doubt about the engagement of literary works with cinema. If you have any doubt, just remember the picturization of classical epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata on national TV. The granthas have been there, of course, since time immemorial, but how it reached all and sundry, even the illiterates after TV telecast, is a matter worth pondering. So studying the interface of literature and film has a wider relevance. Adaptation is, after all, the retelling of important stories of a culture, which provides a way of negotiating cultural heritage and betrays much about the post-colonial project of coming to terms with modernity. If I wish to take a few names to prove what I am saying, Charles Dickens' classic 1861 novel Great Expectations, studied by some students and was adopted into a film once in 1946 and then in 2012. Remember J.K. Rowling or John Grisham and Nicholas Sparks, whose I think 11 movies were based on his work. The fact is that an incredible 70% of the world's top 20 grossing films are based on books. That has been, this research has been published by Frontier Economics. So let's talk about some other names like Virginia Woolf. We can, however, speculate with a high degree of confidence that film made its impact both on Woolf's approaches to aesthetic questions and on her formal solutions to issues of narrative construction. Her way of representing simultaneity in The Lighthouse, the third and final section of the novel, was almost certainly infected by familiarity with cinematic strategies. James Joyce, his relationship to the cinema is rather more diffuse than that of Woolf. Explorations of the topic have addressed the impact of his writing on pre-cinematic technologies and early cinema. In recent work on film and modernism, the figures of Gertrude Stein, Wyndham Lewis, Samuel Beckett have just become very prominent. One can no longer afford to turn away from these mediums as they appropriate a much larger space in our lives than they did in the past. So the project role models and sustains stereotypical ambitions while at the same time interrogating them or projecting them in an immediate manner. Even the focusing on female occupations and household chores can be done differently and subsequently perceived differently. Interpreting or reading a film is as much a discipline as any other, and meanings are often rooted in perspectives and positions. After decades of neglect by academic scholars, popular Indian cinema has recently become the subject of lively inquiry and analysis by both Indian and Western scholars. A landmark for research in this area is the impressive Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema by Ashish Rajadhaksha and Paul Willman. A new journal published by a famous publication house, and that was known as South Asian Popular Culture, that was launched in 2003. And that provided a forum for this dynamic field of studies. So film studies has emerged as one core discipline in the field of media studies and cultural studies as well. So the film is a media text and it has its own visual grammar, it has its own language, own narrative. So it is the record of a communicative event. It cuts across class and caste boundaries, is accessible to all sections of society, and in order to be financially viable needs to incorporate within it all those ingredients which may contribute to its success at the box office. It also attempts to determine the ways in which these films affect the discourse generated by the women movement. Popular movies, undoubtedly, they contribute to the construction and reconstruction of gender values. And this is the time when we must talk about feminism and feminist film theory. The female image, the female as an image, has been a central feature of film and related visual media. In film criticism and theory, making gender the axis of analysis and has entailed a thoroughgoing reconsideration of films for, by, and about women, and a consequent transformation of the canons of film studies. Bringing into focus the overlooked contributions of women to film history has been a key objective of feminist film studies, as well as an organizing principle of women's film festivals and journalism. A concern with representation in both a political sense and an aesthetic sense has also united the activist and theoretical projects of women's film culture. Over the past 2 decades, in the context of feminism and the film, Patricia White, that is a big name in the field, in its Politics and Women's Studies in the Academy, feminist film theory has extended its analysis of gender in the film to interrogate the representation of race, class, sexuality, and nation. She's encompassed media such as television and video into its paradigm and contributed to the rethinking of film historiography, most notably in relation to consumer culture. The feminist interest in popular culture's relation to the socially disenfranchised has influenced film studies' shift from textual analysis and subject positioning to broader cultural studies of institutions and audiences. Another name is Maggie Hume, feminist and film. By her is the first study to apply a broad range of theories to contemporary film. With dazzling insight and critical aplomb, Maggie highlights and explains feminist issues and offers a fascinating array of original film analysis. She begins with an in-depth historical survey of contemporary feminist theory, visual aesthetics, and film theory in general, with a particular focus on the work of Laura Mulvey, Annette Cohn, E. Ann Kaplan, and Bell Hooks. But when we come to feminist film theory, the very first thing that comes into our mind or the mind of the theorist is the representation of women through screen. This representation of women, how the women are being presented and how the spectators are receiving them, that became the central point. And it is not only in the screens, on the silver screen, it is there in our society as well. So I would like to mention here a name, Harnaam Kaur. And she's a 23-year-old when she was diagnosed with PCS. And Harnaam Kaur's journey to being confident in her own skin and body positivity saw many hurdles and societal bounds. She appeared on the front cover for Glamour United Kingdom 2020. You can see what she said. Society wonders, how dare I create my own rules for being a woman? She was having a beard because of the problem she was having, PCOS. So, but she decided to keep that beard. She said that nobody else has got the right to tell how a woman should look. And in an interview with Rock and Roll Bride, she reflected on her decision to keep her beard and said, I quote, I decided to keep my beard and step forward against society's expectations of what a woman should look like. I have realized that this body is mine. I own it. I do not have any other body to live in, so I may as well love it unconditionally, unquote. So this example that how a woman's representation, the typical norms of women's body, mind, thought, and psyche, which were being proclaimed first by literature and then by cinema, it became the central point for feminist film theory. Having been a woman myself, I'm particularly interested in how women were able to overcome limitations, how they found support, their camaraderie, as well as radical urges they were hiding under good behavior or busting into wild remarks, comic confrontations, swagger, seduction, independent wars. I'm perturbed to find that even today, women in Hollywood are viewed as sexual objects. Instead of focusing on the other potential of women, films place more emphasis on women's sexuality, demeanor, and appearance. Females are still objectified by their physical appearance and slender body, like a cliche zero figure, white color, and attractive features. It's highly in demand. If you don't believe me, still go through and see the matrimonial ads in newspaper and apps. You will find such things over there. So most films in the industry rank women's sexiness above their intelligence. That is one major point which was discussed by feminist film theorists. We all know that Bollywood films are not devoid of such objectification. Women characters are either portrayed at one extreme as a doting mother, a loving wife, and a bahu, sanskari bahu, who is busy serving others and fulfilling the familial requirements. On the other extreme, she is portrayed as a vamp who wants to bring havoc on society. However, it is ironic that this very negative character seems to have her own standpoints and is not hesitant to showcase her sexuality or voice herself. Many writers came forward who were just concerned with this anomaly, and they started writing down their point of view, what they were having in the society as a norm, in the films as a norm. So they wrote various issues and published it. And conventionally, in most roles, patriarchal viewpoints are contested in the beginning, but finally, the woman has to give in to the societal pressure. They were looking at that. So critics, they have often argued that of the fear of the masculine, maintaining dominance is the prime goal. Is it what a woman is for? So naturally, my question is, where is feminism in such a circumstance? What is the point of feminist film theory? What it stands for, and how it impacted the reading of a film and seeing films through a feminist film perspective, and how feminist theory perspective can change society. According to Rosen and Haskell, mainstream cinema did not represent women's lived experience, but only stereotypes of women's social status, unquote. You can see on your screen that these are the major works that were written and accepted and conveyed the point of view. Now, we are all aware that, of course, feminism was there. And credit goes to Charles Fourier, who coined the word feminism, Feminisme, in 1837, which we later know as feminism in 1870. So if we trace the history, we find that we have three waves of feminist film theory as well. Just like we have waves of feminism, in the same way, feminist film theory had phases and waves. The 1960s saw the re-emergence of women's rights. Due to the existence of more and more cultural and political inequalities, family laws and marriage laws were questioned, which were actually discriminatory towards women. In the early 1970s, they started to voice their feelings when they felt that the positioning of women in the films does not occur for the mere conventionality of the narrative, but to locate the man and his masculinity as the supreme source of power. The woman is merely shown as an agent of fantasy and sexual pleasure. In the light of this argument, we can go ahead with understanding the first stage of the feminist film theory, which came up largely during the second wave of feminism in the early 1970s. The second wave of feminism found its way into academia. Feminism, which was limited to the right to vote and equality, became a subject matter for the elite too. A lot many texts and essays about women's issues and perspectives also came into existence. Since film studies was also a part of academia, a feminist outlook or reading movies came into existence. It enabled feminist reading and rereading of films and texts. This way, the second wave of feminism gave rise to the feminist film theory. And feminist film theorists criticize classical cinema for its stereotyped representation of women. Its aim was to adequately represent female subjectivity and female desire on the silver screen. With the aim of understanding cinema as a cultural practice that represents and reproduces myths about women and femininity, there were many perspectives, not just one, which was collectively called feminist film theory. Roxana Hedy defines feminist film criticism as advocacy for gender equality by dismantling the patriarchal system that is often sexist, racist, and classist, and approaching cinema as an institution that reflects the politics and viewpoints of a film's creators. She analyzed how women and men are represented in the film. The active deconstruction of patriarchal myths around women is the major goal which feminist film theorists as well as filmmakers set to achieve at that particular time. So feminist critics tried to understand the all-pervasive power of patriarchal imagery with the help of structuralist theoretical frameworks such as semiotics and psychoanalysis. So these theoretical discourses have yielded fruitful results in analyzing the ways in which sexual differences are encoded in the classical narrative. By the late 1980s, feminist film theory had proposed three approaches as to how a film could be deemed feminist: to portray real women, create a counter cinema, or encourage feminist spectators. The approach was important because the narration of women in films was very similar to what was being found in contemporary society. My argument is that when you have a very stereotypical role of the women character on the screen, somehow the women in real life are forced to conform to it, and more so when they are already living with those gender roles. It reinforces those gender notions as to what a woman should be or how the woman should behave. So the entire notion of women was under critical review. Molly Haskell was talking about this, how it created extra pressure on women to follow the norms projected by men through films. In the 1980s, E. Ann Kaplan evoked the works of Claire Johnston and Pam Cook to argue for the need for feminist criticism to challenge generic expectations from the audience. An attempt to decipher the societal gender-based conditioning creates a major difference in the development of a film and viewership of the same. This is largely examined with respect to the mental frameworks where the actual representational divide occurs. Most histories of the field of feminist film studies find a starting point in the appearance of several book-length popular studies of women in film in the United States in the early 1970s. So their focus on images of women was immediately critiqued by cine-feminists or film feminists interested in theorizing the structure of representation. As a result, an opposition, rhetorical in part, arose between American sociological approaches and British theory of cine-feminism, which was based upon a critique of realism. So there we get three theories. One is reflection theory, that has been given by Molly Haskell, then ideological critique, where Claire Johnston just played a very important role, and the most talked about one is psychoanalysis, that is the constructivist theory by Laura Mulvey. One by one, we'll discuss these theories in detail. So the first theory is reflection theory. Feminism and feminist scholars have been central to many theoretical developments in film and media studies. More generally, and feminist film theory itself, as an entity in need of constant re-evaluation, resists the highly critiqued wave model of feminist history. The first phase of feminist film theory during 1968 to 1974 reread the Hollywood cinema and shifted the debate to the portrayal of gender. After analyzing Hollywood cinema, the feminist film critics realized that they have two major issues to work on. They had an objection to the male-centric point of view. That was the first objection. Only male-centric point of view. And the second was a typical cliche representation of women as object of lust. So Molly Haskell's monograph, From Reverence to Rape, the treatment of women at the movies, published in 1974, proved crucial in defining feminist filmmaking as a need to represent real women and questioning how the status quo could be challenged. This feminist film criticism classic that changed the course of film criticism remains an insightful, searing and relevant today as it ever was. Molly Haskell and Rosen's studies are usually considered examples of reflection theories of women in film. They assume that film reflects social reality, that depictions of women in film mirror how society treats women, and that these depictions are distortions of how women really are and what they really want, and that progress can be made. Such accounts are related to powerful feminist critiques of the effects of mainstream media, pornography, advertising on body image, sex roles, and violence against women, which in turn fueled advocacy for women's intervention in image making. Typically, such studies present and critique a typology of image of women, an era of virgins, vamps, victims, suffering mothers, child marriages, sex kittens, etc. So the emerging film criticism of lesbians as well as African American and Asian American women and other women of color also tend to identify and reject stereotypes. These are categories, however, which tend to limit consideration of the social function of stereotypes and frequently lead to simplistic good or bad readings of individual films. The identification of types and generic conventions is an important step, but simply replacing, you can say, stereotypes with positive images, that could not transform the system that produced them. So Haskell narrativizes the history of film as an arc from reverence, that was the silent era, reverence, to rape. The high point is represented by the strong, independent heroines, which reached its apotheosis in stars such as Catherine Hepburn. So presenting herself as a maverick critic, Haskell frequently distances herself from feminism, neglects to consider non-white women, and betrays profound heterosexism. So yet, she makes several useful contributions, and criticism of the reductionism of her study can itself be reductive. She diagnoses violence against and marginalization of women in acclaimed new Hollywood films as reaction to the emergence of feminism and the threat posed by women's autonomy. And she is wary of the mystification of European art cinema, which would appear to place women and their sexuality more centrally in their stories while offering only a new version of the eternal feminine. That is what this reflection theory tells us. And finally, Haskell's comments on the women's picture or VP of production category denigrated by the industry and most critics suggest that such films actually did represent the contradictions of women's lives in patriarchal capitalism and inaugurated one of the most fruitful areas of feminist film studies. Then we have the second theory, that is the ideological critique. Reviewing Haskell and Rosen books, Clare notes the inadequacies of the images of women approach. While it grasps the ideological implications of cinema, images are seen as too easily detached from the text and psychic structures through which they function, as well as the institutional and historical context that determine their form and their reception. For Johnston, the film must be seen as a language and woman as a sign, not simply a transparent rendering of the real. Perhaps the most influential statement of this position, women cinema is counter cinema, Johnston combines Roland Barthes' concept of myth as the rendering natural of ideology with auteur theory to decode the function of women in Hollywood films by Howard Hawks and John Ford. You already know that auteur theory holds that the director who oversees all audio and visual elements of the motion picture is more to be considered the author of the movie than the writer of the screenplay. So, in her article, Women's Cinema is Counter Cinema, Clare says that woman is not men in classical Hollywood cinema. This ideological representation of women as not man is being disguised by Hollywood cinema by using conventions of realism. So thus the female character is only a sign bearing the negative meaning of what is considered male. And moreover, this woman has no meaning in its own right and thus takes no subject position. This theorizing of women as not man in the 70s was a useful concept for showing how patriarchal ideology worked and was introduced by feminists like Simone de Beauvoir and Kate Millett. Then we have this constructive theory. It was clear how Hollywood effectively married visual pleasure to narrative coherence at the very dawn of classical cinema. But in solving this formal problem, Hollywood unwittingly created a new political problem, one which would only be grasped in the second half of the 20th century. With the emergence of the feminist film theory and the experimental films this theory helped to shape. Namely, in retaining the element of visual pleasure centered on the spectacle of the beautiful star and in folding it neatly, you can say that into the narrative under the alias of the male protagonist and who watches her for us. Us means spectators. Classical cinema implicitly endorsed the stereotypes of active, voyeuristic male and the passive, exhibitionistic female. So as cinema rose to become by far the most popular medium of public entertainment, reaching audiences in the millions, it became the agency chiefly responsible for perpetuating those stereotypes. Now, here in this constructive theory, through psychoanalysis, issues of film feminism or cine psychoanalysis dominated with leading figures such as Laura Mulvey, Jacqueline Rose, Kaja Silverman, Teresa de Lourdes, and many others. We have some real serious issues addressed by them. So these theories criticize the naive essentialism of early feminism, moving the focus from biological sexual identity seen as tied to nature to gender, seen as a social construct shaped by cultural and historical contingency, variable and therefore reconstructible. Rather than focus on the image of women, feminist theories transferred their attention to the gendered nature of vision itself and the role of voyeurism, fetishism, narcissism, and the construction of a masculinist view of women. Let us have some more detail about this constructive theory. Psychoanalytic feminism, this is also known as that, is a theory of oppression which asserts that men have an inherent psychological need to subjugate women. The root of men's compulsion to dominate women and women's minimal resistance to subjugation lies deep within the human psyche. This branch of feminism seeks to gain insight into how our psychic lives develop in order to better understand and change women's oppression. The pattern of oppression is also integrated into society, thus creating and sustaining patriarchy. Through the application of psychoanalytic techniques to studying differences between women and men, as well as the ways in which gender is constructed, it is possible to reorganize socialization patterns as the early stages of human life. In her seminal article, Gender and the Culture of Empire Towards a Feminist Ethnography of the Cinema, Ella Shohat discusses how imperial narratives are organized around metaphors of rape, fantasies of rescue, and eroticized geographies. Gender and colonial discourses intersect with Hollywood's exploitation of Asia, Africa, Latin America as the pretext for eroticized images. So this problem was global. And Laura Mulvey's seminal essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, was at the forefront of these transformations, identifying how visual pleasure in classic Hollywood cinema reproduces a structure of male looking at female to be looked atness, a binary structure. which mirrors the asymmetrical power relations operative in the real social world. Laura Mulvey was then a professor of film and media studies at Birkbeck College, University of London. Visual media that respond to masculine voyeurism will tend to sexualize women for a male viewer, as well as the male characters being depicted on the screen. We'll often see the point of view shots from the male character's perspective. And it's been over 45 years since the film critic Laura Mulvey first coined the term male gaze. In that very essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, the male gaze is referred to as a way of seeing women and the world through a masculine perspective and point of view. The psychology of the male gaze is comparable to the Freudian concept of scopophilia, which is defined as the pleasure of looking. So that male gaze that was hurting women, and she gave the slogan, "Don't gaze me, bro." And it had various other things to discuss in detail. It became a theory in itself. In regards to representation in film, the male gaze is seen to strip away the human identity of female characters. The woman is visually positioned as an object of heterosexual male desire through the use of the camera. Her feelings, thoughts, and her own sexual drives are less important when compared to her male counterparts, which often sees the female characters being almost invisible in the narrative. If they were to be removed from the film, then the plot wouldn't be affected by their lack of presence. It is worth mentioning that the male gaze doesn't take into account homosexual or queer gazes, as Mulvey's concept is more accurately described as a heterosexual masculine gaze. From the feminist perspective, this theory can be viewed in three ways. Number one, how men look at women. Number two, how women look at themselves. And finally, how women look at other women. So this phrase, male gaze, it occurred only twice in that essay by Mulvey. But it has become the shorthand for describing the main point of the essay. Clearly, Mulvey hoped that her own films would be a part of this new cinema. But it is evident from the continued dominance of traditional fiction film that the pleasures that she hoped to destroy keep coming back. Whether this is because the patriarchal system is indeed unbreachable, or whether it indicates a flaw in her own argument, is something that must be explored further elsewhere. The fault lies in Mulvey's necessary simplification, which subordinates critical insight to political expediency. Nevertheless, it is clear that visual pleasure and narrative cinema will inevitably be remembered for its formulation of this male gaze. Mulvey argues that, I quote, "the male figure cannot bear the burden of sexual objectification. Man is reluctant to gaze," unquote. So according to Mulvey, a man possesses the gaze because he's a man. However, a woman has the gaze only when she assumes the role of a male viewer, when she objectifies others by gazing at them like a man. A good example of this is the way that Chris Pine's Steve Trevor is presented in Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman, and the roles are reversed. However, this is not the equivalent of the female gaze. When women are the protagonist of the action-based films, they will continue to be presented through the lens of the male gaze, because it is only mimicking the male gaze and is not the norm. Laura Mulvey influenced Hindi cinema also, so-called Bollywood. Hindi cinema is one of the key cultural influences on Indian society. We cannot deny that. In mainstream Bollywood cinema, the new trend has been to tactfully structure the plot in a way that appears to promote women's empowerment. But a close reading would tell how those films are based on the same regressive ideology. The female lead gets to have increased screen time. She gets to fight the bad guys like a male hero and makes it a point to say out loud that she does not here to solve the conflict at hand. But is it enough? As Mulvey wrote, women are characterized by their to-be-looked-atness in cinema. So a woman is a spectacle and a man is the bearer of that look. And we all know that even the female character, they are very bold. They come up with certain things that are not acceptable. But towards the end of the cinema, they accept those norms. So somewhere the message is being conveyed that what is the acceptability. In Mulvey's theory, it is unusual to see men sexualized in the same way as women. And that cinema doesn't invite women to desire men's bodies. In order for women or a person of any gender other than the male gender, the viewer must learn to identify with the male protagonist. How is a film progressive if that is all it tries to be? How is a narrative organic if the empowering dialogues clearly sound like someone behind the camera was dying for brownie points for making a feminist film? They are giving extra time. They are making female-oriented films, but somewhere they just want to take this credit. And then comes the films that show supposedly sexually liberated women, resulting in more male gaze and more objectification of women. So such female characters explore many potential lovers, hang out at clubs, casually take puffs of cigarettes. That is it. Films like Cocktail come to mind, and a question is, for whom such characters are being created? Now, according to Mulvey comes here again. According to Mulvey, cinema has been affiliated with three different looks. Looks of the camera. It more than a character on the screen. It is the camera that gives you the male look, the male point of view, the focus of the camera. That gives you something that is important, worth consideration. So looks of the camera as the pro-filmic actions are recorded. Looks of the audiences as the final product is viewed by them. And finally, the characters at each other within the screen illusion. But the main practice of narrative film techniques disagrees with the first two looks and considers them to be inferior to the third. So the main intention is always to remove the presence of prime cameras and by restricting distance information from the audience. So now you can see that the first look is perspective of the male character on screen. How he views the woman character, the spectators, they look in the same way. He is not looking for himself. He is looking for the spectator. There comes the perspective of the spectator. And the male audience members' perspective of the male character in the film. So we have men looking at women through the camera, as we discussed these, women looking at themselves through that particular norm, and women looking at women and identifying with the male norm. So look of the audience is something very important that gives meaning to all these theories. So this enables the spectators to the erotic image on the screen directly. Therefore, Mulvey's theory breaks the main motive of illusion, which is to create a world of obsession by hiding the fear of unmanning, being enchanted by the image on screen. So these three levels of the cinematic gaze, you must understand it if you want to understand Mulvey. That when the camera looks at woman character from which point of view, and it decides where to focus on women's body, then the character and the spectator, finally the male spectator sitting in the audience, they all objectify the female character and make her into a spectacle. Numerous Indian feminist film critics, they drew on Mulvey's analysis and have theorized the workings of Indian cinema. In her essay, The Avenging Woman in Indian Cinema, Lalitha Gopalan, along the lines of Mulvey's essays, theorizes that the female body has always been the main object of focus. Women in Indian films are typecast as objects who abide by all rules and regulations of the patriarchal societies. Furthermore, the concept of conventional heterosexual division of labor is employed to give pleasure to the audience. Adding to this, the style of narration, just to suit the sensibilities of male audiences, portrayed men as active and female as passive, unquote. This is what said by Gopalan. She also discussed the feminist film theories on sex and violence and the movies which portray women as avengers. Carol Clover, a famous feminist film theorist, argued that these movies, which are otherwise very cautiously managed by the mainstream films tailored for the male gaze, very superficially touch on some complicated issues like gender and spectatorship. So Indian feminist film theorists, if we name them, another name comes Vandana Shiva. She argued that the male ego is gratified by objectifying women. She received the Alternative Nobel Prize in 1993 for placing women and ecology at the heart of the debate on modern development. Then Steve Dern provided ethnographic evidence to support the applicability of Mulvey's arguments in Indian cinema. Hindi films treat women on screen as an object of men's and the camera's gaze. Hello? Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, you are audible, ma'am.
Yeah, sorry for the power cut. The screen is visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So we were discussing about Indian feminist film critiques. So how they were just they had faith in Mulvey, and they were just doing justice with their theories on the basis of Mulvey's theory. So Hindi films, like they were also being just framed and being just critics were writing, and they were giving their views on the basis of the theories as already given by Western theorists. So even some Indian film makers, they also just commented on such things. Like there is an entire genre of songs called item numbers. And in industry which generally have a showgirl or dancer performing and a predominantly male audience watching, they are deliberately inserted into the film, often without any direct connection with the rest of the film, to attract audiences. Sometimes the one item song ends up making a film a hit. So in these songs, the styling in terms of makeup and costumes, and the cinematic elements of lighting and shot taking, the focus, the way the body is arranged with respect to the camera, and hence the eye of the audience, the movements of the body, all add up in turning the woman into a spectacle.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
PPT
Yes.
is not visible.
Okay,
PPT is not visible.
Just a minute, ma'am. Just a minute. I think it stopped sharing. Let me know when it is visible.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It is visible now.
Okay, thank you. So we were talking about these item numbers. That is a proof what Mulvey said about film studies. Then we all are aware the position of director Prakash Jha. He is a serious kind of person, a filmmaker, and his comment is worth considering when he talks about four gazes in connection with Indian films. The portrayal of women in films is through the male gaze, said famous Bollywood director Prakash Jha. He then went on to cite four gazes that plague the film industry, especially Bollywood. So referring to the combination as male gazes, Jha said that the portrayal of the ideal woman in cinema is from the male perspective. The first problem, according to Jha, is the male point of view, which is inherent in the stories that are told through cinema. He said it is not only the gaze, but the point of view is also very, very important, which gives rise to such elements. The second is the gaze of the camera and all that it reveals about the woman to the audience. The third is the male character's response to the woman on the screen. And lastly, the response of the men in the audience to the woman on the screen. So even today, the male gaze controls Bollywood. Most of our films hardly have strong women characters, and the idea is to have women either in bikinis or to focus the camera on their bodies. There is no liberation on screen in an industry where female actors are mostly relegated to being sex symbols, unquote. This was said by a famous actor, Tanishta Chatterjee. So Prakash Jha always believed that Bollywood needs to withdraw its male gaze and give some respect to the women on screen as well. While discussing Mulvey, this is one more concept that is very, very important to understand. This is the term she mentioned in her feminist film theory, scopophilia. So Mulvey said men act, women appear. Just listen, men act, women appear, men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at, unquote. I repeat it. Men act, women appear, men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at, unquote. So that quote suggests the position of women in the realm of the look, including within the mainstream Indian cinema. Consider the first part of the statement, men act, women appear. In Indian cinema, women have been relegated to the passive position in film after film as bearer, not the maker of meaning. Merely just an appendage to the man, the wielder of power. So Mulvey draws on the works of famous psychologist Sigmund Freud and critiques Freudian theory in her analysis of scopophilia. According to Freud, the fact that femininity arises out of a critical course of parallel development between the sexes, also known as masculine or phallic for boys as well as girls, is the major cause of complicating femininity. Now, feminist criticism gradually shifted from envisioning the female body as a spectacle to advocating for a more complex and potentially disruptive female point of view, as Prakash Jha said. The point of view is very, very important. And whereas for Annette Cohn, conventional cinema remained an important vector of change, Mary Ann Doyne and Linda Williams argued that the disruption triggered by the adoption of a female point of view could also be reinterpreted by a masculine discourse so as to validate its own hegemony. You find that scopophilia, that literally means love of watching. So these matters were rendered more complex, and for Mary, even though a film might not be a feminist reading proved influential in exposing a movie's patriarchal undertones. Understood in this light, feminist filmmaking could be assessed by paying close attention to the spectators, which Steiger referred to as feminist spectatorship, and their perception of feminist attitude. So alternatives to psychoanalytic feminist film theory raise new questions about the representation of women in films because of their different accounts of the self, agency, identity, and the cultural surroundings. They reflect more textured and nuanced views about the self's complexity and emphasize the film viewer's potential to construct critical readings. In so doing, they offer more scope for feminist social change than a view which maintains we are in effect products of the text around us. Laura Mulvey's essay described a context in which voyeurism, fetishism, and narcissism all structure film viewing. Mulvey's insight derived from the study of the relationship between film techniques, spectators, and viewing pleasures is that film deliberately create masculine structures of looking. Fetishism overplays the woman's objectification, puts her on a pedestal, builds up the glamour and physical beauty of the female store, and invests in her the potential for erotic satisfaction. So she believed that, according to Mulvey, two modes of the male gaze, voyeuristic like seeing women as bores and fetishistic like seeing women as Madonnas. So sexism exists not only in the content of the text, but also exists in how the text is presented. The question of the female spectatorship was also raised by her. So a woman's body is sexualized even when the woman's body is unrelated to the advertised product. You just see 10 products, and where there is nothing to do with a woman, even a sexy image of a woman would be portrayed. So voyeurism is associated with the fantasy of mastery and control, asserting control and subjecting the guilty person through punishment or forgiveness. That is some part of a theory told by that. But the option of female spectatorship in this respect are three. One is adopting masculinity. Take it as it is. Then the masochism of over-identification or losing one's self in the image. And then narcissism in becoming one's own object of desire. This too is a fantasy of being one with the image in Hollywood cinema. This often means becoming one with the fantasized image of masculine desire. That was the thing, that was the questions that were something that the thought process that Mulvey created through her writing in not only in one country, but in several countries, and women and men alike. After Mulvey, one major theory came, and one major theorist, the name was Kaza Silverman, and she gave the theory of female voice. I'm going to just read something from this particular book, just a few lines. I quote, Kaja Silverman says, I feel impelled to stress once again that the fetish classically functions not so much to conceal women's castration as to deny man's, and that this goal can be achieved only by identifying lack with what is exclusive to women with her anatomy. As I have already remarked above, the substitution of the glance or shine for the glance shifts attention and effect away from the subject to the object, the viewer to the spectacle. It also transfers a certain value from the male to the female subject, so that she comes to occupy the place formerly occupied by him, to stand in for him, and in so doing to cover over his lack. It is thus the woman herself who represents the original fetish, the woman herself who is required to conceal from the male subject what he cannot know about himself, unquote. So regardless of whether the cinematic projection is understood in its most technological or its most ideological sense, it always both implicates and exceeds the viewer. So, of course, I do not mean to suggest that cinema constructs sexual differences all by itself. However, I do mean to propose that, be it Hollywood or Bollywood, it plays more than a reproductive role in the construction of sexual differences. It is no coincidence that the history of cinema has coincided with the ever-increasing specularization of women. Indeed, I would argue that cinema has contributed massively to what might be called the revisualization of sexual difference. I say revisualization because the insistent equation of woman with spectacle and man with vision marks a shift in the general terms of cultural reference which occurred between 1750 and the present. It also encourages us to understand the great masculine renunciation in terms of the female subject it constructs. A female subject who is the mirror reflection not only of the male subject's castration, but of his specularity, exhibitionism, and narcissism. Now, here I would just mention a film, Possessed, just to give an example. So in that particular film, an unconscious woman is injected with a drug which induces her to speak on command. What she is obliged to produce in this way is, of course, her past, which flashes onto the screen as her voice embarks upon its regressive journey. Interiority is thus extracted through action upon the body. Liquid is injected into a woman in order that a cluster of memories can then be projected both onto the doctor's diagnostic screen and onto our cinematic screen. The slippage between inner and outer is recreated by the doctor when he tells his patient that the drug he is giving her will help you to tell us what we want. And when he confides to a colleague, he says, every time I see the reaction to this treatment, I get the same thrill I did the first time, unquote. And when he foregrounds the structuring role, his own desires play in the talking cure. Interiority and exteriority also spill over each other in the narrative that ensures, since the patient, I think played by John Crawford, is shown to suffer from a deafening noise which seems to assail her from without. So, Lady in the Dark gives a more explicitly ideological inflection to the concept of interiority. And the central character in that film, Lisa Elliott, is the editor-in-chief of a fashion magazine, an untenably potent discursive portion for an American woman in 1944. She's consequently eased out of the job she has successfully performed for a number of years and redefined first as a spectacle and then as a wife. So this particular movie just proved that point of view. And it is not limited to Hollywood alone. It is there in various films you will find in Bollywood as well. Now, what is the answer? The theorist gave answer in the form of counter cinema. What we know that some films like Queen and some other films, we find that, okay, the things are changed. Now the spectacle is changed, the point of view is changed. So such films are known as counter cinema. The practice of feminist counter cinema comes in, which tends to sway away from the conventional notions of filmmaking and narrativization. Feminist filmmakers see these films that they would essentially free the look of the camera and create a space for masculine detachment. So another important aspect is that the conflict doesn't lie between men and women, but in the way they are placed in the larger framework of power relations. So both the film and the spectator are contesting a power play. Judith Main, I remember what she said, that it is precisely in exploring female spectatorship that feminist film theorists have challenged the dichotomy. So this counter cinema argues that patriarchy is nothing but an outcome of these certain theoretical discussions like psychoanalysis. So therefore, women's counter cinema, or the women's cinema as popularly known, in Foucault's term, it is an attempt to concentrate on discourses that have been avoided so far. We remember Claire Johnston suggested that one should learn to function at various levels, which means that movies should also be made in different genres other than male-dominated ones. Not only did he appreciate the handful of women filmmakers, but also hope for an increase in number, resulting in a change of outlook. So today it is not difficult to name many female directors who are making such counter cinema in Bollywood, like Deepa Mehta, Meera Nair, Kalpana Lazmi, Farha Khan. They have created their space in the film industry. And apart from that, in many films, women and issues relating to women are featured. It can be noticed that both male and female directors in Bollywood have focused on issues related to women in their films. And they are also being represented. Women are represented with respect and dignity, and their point of view. Feminine psyche is being explored. Feminine psyche is being presented, and that gave somehow birth to female gaze. The term came female gaze in position. But before, when we discuss this, we must not forget that feminist film theories have based their analysis on two major aspects of Foucault's theory of power. First, the idea that film produces a real effect is not entirely applicable, because reality effect is also produced by the film product's textual operation. And social relation of power between the various parts of the film industry, like the camera, director, producer, crew, editors, is equally influenced by the reality effects as the spectators. They are also important. They also affect the making of the film. So, in the context of third cinema that we know, where the camera is a weapon and cinema is guerrilla warfare, women falls out of the system of representation. According to one critic known as Khanna, the crisis signals a self-reflective movement in representation in which subaltern figures cannot speak or report the trauma of memory through words. The other aspect of Foucault's theory that influenced the feminist film theorists was his idea of resistance, which existed with power relations. He also suggested that resistance leaves its traces despite being separated by social and institutional strata. So, along similar lines, the role of power relations is contradicted by counter cinema. And female gaze, which is rare, of course. So, it is not just the opposite of the male gaze. The female gaze is from a woman's point of view. In movies and other media, the audience is required to observe from the perspective of a woman. And different critics have defined feminist film theories differently, which further provide a various understanding kind of thing. That Laura Mulvey, once again I will quote, that a woman is always the object to the subject of the man. This binary opposition is established by the structuring of the narrative, and the use of the camera, movements and angles help in fixating and strengthening this position, unquote. So Linda Williams, in her essay, When the Woman Looks, you must go through that, talks about the concept of blindness, where the female protagonist is not allowed to return the gaze of the male protagonist, for that would seem to move beyond a woman's limitation. So cinema has inherited a great deal from theoretical and literary melodrama. However, the association of melodrama with femininity can be detected in the pejorative attitude with which it is often regarded. Now, just go through this picture and I will ask 2-3 questions. Go through this picture. Now let me know if you have seen about the dress of the man. Anybody can tell me what was the color of his pant and shirt? Can you tell me?
Black and white.
Black and white. Anybody else?
Yeah, ma'am, black and white.
Black and white. What else you could see in that picture?
Tie, black tie, I think.
He was
And
kneeling.
what was the color of the dress of woman?
Red.
Red.
Okay. And in the second picture, what could you see?
In one side, a family was there, a woman with 2 kids, and a single woman was there in another picture.
What was, do you recognize that woman, the single picture of that woman?
She had a bold look.
No, the Indian celebrity that way.
Salina Jetli.
No, not Salina Jetli.
No.
Sunny Leone, I think.
Sunny Leone, yes. Sunny Leone.
Okay. Now we are coming to this picture where you can see he is wearing a blue pant and a light blue shirt. And of course, that is red. Now, what is happening? In the second picture, you see that, of course, Sunny Leone is there. But in the second picture also, you see Sunny Leone is again there with her family, with kids and husband, 3 kids and husband doing Gadpati Puja. Now, this image has been so constantly drilled into the Indian female psyche that women themselves, they start believing in a different kind of portrait. Now, before I come to these pictures, I just tell you that space between a strong woman's real life and her portrayal on celluloid needs to be negotiated, and positive ambience and foreground. Indian cinema, that is something you say, women's film. This is Sunny Leone in a strong role, like a typical role that we see. And now she is doing Pooja in the second role, and she's there with the family. So nobody is typically even ready to recognize her in that particular role, because that is the concept that she presents over there. And in this also, the same thing happened, that we ignored the person, and we just, within a fraction of second, our first attention, it was there, whether male or female, it went to the female. So now what happened? Why it is something? This was just explained by Teresa de Lettres when she said that I think the problem of a specificity of women's cinema and aesthetic forms in terms so far address who is making films for who is looking and speaking, how, where, and to whom, then what has been seen as an ideological split within feminist film culture between theory or practice, or between formalism and activism, may appear to be the very strength. So when we just go through such things, now what is the concept of the strong woman that was favored and suggested by all these female theorists, that they wanted that female feminist film criticism should focus on that? So in conclusion to this long drawn debate, we can just infer that the revolutionary underpinnings of the feminist film theory grant an identity to the side cast woman and brings her to the fore on celluloid. Though even in contemporary times, various male-centric codes and conventions are to be shunned. However, the emergence of women filmmakers, the multiplicity of viewpoints, expansion of the women's space, both on the screen and in terms of the spectatorship, signify women's successful struggle of self-representation on the silver screen. So, I am a woman, therefore strong, therefore invincible. That is the message to be conveyed. Not I am a girl, therefore powerless and therefore destined to suffer. So that message being conveyed movie after movie. I need a man for my support. I need a man to do anything. Ultimately, whatever I do, I'll have to go back to a man and submit. So this is something, the change in women's point of view, to change the Indian female psyche, to believe in the equality that you really desire. So that is something that has been conveyed by feminist film critics. Now, what happened whenever I talk about feminism in other essays, not particularly this subject, so many questions when they just talk to me, they just ask, what will you say where in families like women are just doing violence against women? They are the major, they are playing the major role. So I give them an answer that those women who are instrument, they are not doing that. They are not women in the concept. Rather, they are the instrument of patriarchy. Whatever patriarchal role model has been given to them, they are just fulfilling that, and they want others to be a part of that. They want others to fit in that particular role. They want others to follow the norm. So you must be aware of the name Alice Walker. When she gave the term sisterhood is the only solution, then she said that unless and until a woman understands another woman, unless and until that woman makes a man understand the female psyche, this problem is not going to end.
Excuse me,
So just note down.
voice is very low.
Yeah. Voice is low. Hello.
Low.
Yeah. Is it now better?
No, ma'am.
Hello.
Ma'am, you're
Hello,
audible.
it is
You're
very
audible.
low, ma'am.
You're audible. It may be a network issue on the part of the participant.
Okay. Okay. So changes in cinema and developments in cultural theory ask for a new focus on experience, body, and act. Important new sources for revitalizing feminist film theory are performance studies, new media theory, phenomenology, and a delusion body of thought. So these are theoretical frameworks that move beyond the semiotic preoccupation with meaning, representation, and interpretation. In this way, feminist film theory returns once again to the revolutionary attitude that started it all in the 1960s, creating space for the multiple becomings of the female character and the female spectator. Now, feminist film theory has had to branch off into other areas to encompass a wider worldview, sexuality, and ethnicity playing a big part in this. The question of sexual difference becomes muddy when lesbian spectatorship is questioned. The feminist argument has broken down barriers but has also raised other questions. This has entailed turning away from cataloging correct or positive images which are seen to voice women's reality. For such catalogs not only suggest that there are such final judgments to be made, but also pin down the feminine to an orthodoxy within which no struggle can be articulated. Theorists have sought to find the right range of definitions inscribed within representations of sexual differences, disaggregating those categories which act to fix and polarize sexual difference. So there you will find all these names, particularly this in Spectatorship, the Power of Looking On by Michael Aaron. So further you will have to, further theories, you will have to go through them. So if the feminine is primarily signified through the image, then the female spectator's narcissistic identification is directed to the female body. But in the woman's film, this body is offered in a de-eroticized form. And so the female spectator is brought to identify with a body that no longer carries the signs of femininity. So this is another portion. To desexualize the female body is ultimately to deny its very existence. And this, Doyen argues, renders the position of female spectatorship disembodied. So the impossibility of occupying an embodied and distinctly feminine position denies the female spectator a place from which to read. Now, should feminists canonize women in the film industry? Or should they focus on producing a feminist theory for all films regardless of the gender of their producers? What about women as spectators of the film? What are the differences between and among women, like race, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, physical ability? And how are these central to feminist engagements? Perhaps because this lively and unbridled debate is at the center of feminist film theory. So we must find answers to certain questions. We should raise more and more questions like this. So a growing number of scholars have acknowledged how the works of feminist scholars and feminist film scholars have influenced filmmakers and screenwriters. Feminism itself keeps on evolving. So what might count as good feminism is bound to change with time. Yes, we are discussing the fifth wave of feminism. I feel critics and scholars should question a movie's potential feminist agenda in relation to its epoch and target audience. In this thing, you must discuss Helen Sixo's This Sex Which Is Not One and When Our Lips Speak Together. This is also very important. This will give you another point of view. We don't have much time to discuss that, but Irigaira's tendency to conflate the body, which he constructs in This Sex Which Is Not One, with the actual female body, also works to close down the psychic, physical, social, economic, and political differences between women, fashioning them all according to the logic of the same. So, you know that on what is needed here is not so much a masculinization or opposition of masculinization of the female subject as a feminization of the male subject, a much more generalized acknowledgement, in other words, of the necessary terms of cultural identity. It is by now a truism of the film's theory that movies construct viewing subjects through identification. It seems to me that authorial subjects can be similarly constructed. Identity is, after all, impossible not only outside the symbolic but outside the imaginary. So we may be more aware of the male gaze and the depiction of women, but it's such an integrated part of our popular culture that it may never disappear. But how do we try to balance out the effects of the male gaze, and how do we define the female gaze? Is there any queer gaze, a gay gaze, a lesbian gaze, or a transgender gaze? These are the questions. And what are the differences between how white females are depicted on screen compared to Dalit women or women of color? There is still so much to explore. And while Malve touched upon the gaze, she only saw this through her own experience as a white gender female living in the West. How we view film has certainly changed since Malve's essays, and perhaps now with social media sites such as Instagram, we have all become subject to the gaze. We post such photos on Facebook and Insta that we put ourselves to gaze. That is another thing. The question is, are we bigger voyeurs than we were 40 odd years ago? Perhaps the situation is a lot worse than it was when Malve was writing it. If so, what can be done to counterbalance the male gaze? So we can delineate the contours of 21st century feminist movies and series and establish the ascendancy of feminist theory over the current film and television production. The corpus had a specific political meaning and referred to a plethora of cinematic concepts, from Laura Mulvey's theory of male gaze to Kaja Silverman's theory of female voice, through Teresa's theory of guerrilla cinema, which were successfully adapted and updated to a post #MeToo context and intersectional concerns of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. So feminist film theory, it not only makes us understand to have a different kind of viewership, but it also gives us space how to reconstruct our society, to make this society a better place to live for a woman, for the other gender. So this is an important concept of feminism in particular. Thank you so much for patient hearing.
Propose to extend vote of thanks on behalf of HRDC Nagpur University.
Excuse me, ma'am.
So,
Excuse me, sir, for a minute.
Yes.
Ma'am, I want to say I'm also from Kanpur University, from PPM College.
Okay. May I know your name?
Glad to see you here. Dr. Pooja Pandya.
Okay, okay. Hi, Pooja.
I have also read your book, Feminism, A Paradigm Shift, in my research project.
Okay. Thank you so much. So much. Hope
Glad
you
to
like
see you, ma'am, here.
Thank you.
ma'am,
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pooja.
Excuse me, ma'am. I do have a question.
Okay.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But you are not
Okay.
visible.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right now
now
I'm
you are.
visible. Okay. My question is regarding Malve's the three gazes, right? So there you talked about the spectator, the character, and the camera.
Right.
Right. So what happens to a woman who is a spectator and she is not accompanied by a male company while watching a movie when a woman is trying to bridge the gap between objectification and agency? For example, it was my own experience which happened in around in 2015 when I went to the theater watching, and this is a metropolitan city which I'm talking about. So I went to the theater where this was a movie which was made from a very feminist angle, and where the scene was one of necrophilia, like the dead body of the woman was being fantasized upon, and it had a different context, of course, but it was not something that the point of view of the director was supporting. Rather, it was criticizing it. Okay, but then me as a single woman watching those scenes in the movie, I was also subject to gaze by a lot of males who were watching it, maybe from a point of view of pornography. They were not getting that feminist angle at all. So this was something that I realized, this may be the fourth kind of a gaze which a female spectator watching a feminist movie may be subject to. That's all I have to say.
No. This is not the fourth kind of thing. Mulvey has addressed this also, and Mulvey has told about it. She said that that is the spectator's point of view, how they are viewing the woman in the film and how they are viewing women in general in real life and real life both. So this is the point she raised, that actually what is happening, the representation that is there in the film is affecting the society at large. It is affecting your point of view, as Prakash Jha also told, that another, the fourth thing is point of view. Point of view is something that determines whether you are seeing the real woman or the real woman. So your point of view makes you a man, the kind of man you are, or the kind of woman you are. So that is something very important, and that is the fourth point that you felt, that was the point of view, right? So that was also discussed by Malve and Prakash Jha both. Of course, that is something that we experience every time. Like you see a film, and whatever you like, you are seeing a romantic film or a horror film, your point of view, if you are seeing a horror film, the lady sitting next to you, you will not see her from that angle. So what will happen, that whatever you are looking at, definitely it is going to affect your psyche and your point of view. That has been discussed by Mulvey in detail.
Okay. It is a part of the third gaze.
It's the point of, yes, of course,
the point
it is
of
the
view of
spectators,
the spectators. Okay.
Another division of the spectators' perception.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice talking to you. Dr.
Any
Singh,
question from?
Yeah, may I leave, or anything else is there?
No, madam. Actually, I want to extend vote of thanks on behalf of HRDC Nagpur University. Okay, thank you, madam, for your detailed research, in-depth analysis and discussion of the literary engagement with cinema and feminist film theory. You just started with the two quotations regarding these film studies, and you talked about the film literary, the literary engagement with cinema is boundless because they are both directly deals with the images. And you also talked about the films are multi-layered texts that are rich with different meanings, denotative and connotative meanings. And you have just elaborated to point out that the representation of women in films, um, which the feminist approach of film criticism talks about. And you also just mentioned the books turned into films, like Charles Dickens' classic novels, Great Expectation, or the other films like Guide, Omkara, Makbul. So these films are based on the the analysis and focus, that in-depth analysis of film and film theory and representation of women screen that is enunciated by Maggie Hum. And you also interestingly and very innovative way presented a kind of the female body gazers. The female body as a sexual object is objectified and gazed, and and also the female kind of the feminism and feminist theory, how the feminist theory is related to the feminist film theory, and you objectivity in this kind of theoretical reading is proclaimed and challenging the stereotypical representation of female body. You just mentioned the three main approaches, a kind of the reflection theory and the ideological critique, and also the constructivist theories. And very interestingly, you just elaborated the reflection theory. That is very enticing to me. Gaze, the heterosexual masculine gaze, as set by Laura Mulvey. And in this male gaze, you express that it has its unequal power relations. Gazer is the superior and the object of gaze is inferior. And Laura Mulvey influenced the Indian Bollywood cinema you just talked about. And you just mentioned three looks, three levels of gazes, and the Indian feminist film critics, and also mentioned the four gazes by director Prakash Jha, especially by male. And according to Prakash Jha, you just said by your through your slide that Bollywood cinema needs to withdraw the male gaze and have to pay respect to the woman. And you just talked about the voyeurism, fetishism, narcissism, and just talked about the Kaja Silverman after the film critic Laura Mulvey. And you just talked about the counter narrative, counter cinematic narrative, and also the female gaze as by Kaja Silverman. And you just talk about the power and knowledge, the relation between power and knowledge as by Michel Foucault, and concept of strong man. And you ended your talk by the should feminist canon women in the film industry, and also you just talked ended that the feminist film theory is evolving, is growing to the further dimensions of thoughts. So thank you, madam. Thank you. Your enlarged, your detailed analysis of this kind of topic. Thank you from the on behalf of all the participants and HRDC Nagpur University. Thank you, madam.
I personally thank you for such a wonderful way of summarizing the lecture. It's really, really commendable. I really thank you for that.
Okay, thank you, madam.
Okay.
The session is over now. Okay.